All right, so I think we're ready to go, and I'll welcome you all to come on up. And if if you're several people deep, if you could just wait a chance to be able to get a chance to talk to us, feel free to come on up and share your ideas. As an organization, we started with volunteers listening to the community and understanding how that road worked and didn't work, and that's what led to our creation of a new design that NCDOT eventually did adopt, and are now working with that design to come up with a final design. So our experience with DOT goes back over a decade. That's a different division than the one that we're working with here. Brian Birch is here. Brian, thank you so much for coming in. I know you could have easily just stayed home today, but I really appreciate you being here. Brian is the Division 14 Director. There are going to be some specific questions that you may have about these maps. You know, is there a signal light here? Is there a curb cut here? Brian will be able to answer that. Several of our traffic engineers that are here will be able to help read these maps. We clean these maps up a lot to try and make them as clean and as legible as possible for you. We may have missed some stuff along the way. So if you have questions and you're not able to get any one of us to ask that question, I'm just going to remind you, put it on a post-it note, slap it on here. That's all going to go home with us, and I'll tabulate all this information, share it with our team, share it with DOT, and we're going to share it with the public so that you can come back and you can see and make sure that we got this right. We'll also put all these pages separately. Will be listed on a Facebook page, like a photo gallery. So you'll be able to go to a particular map where you have a concern and write in the comments section, share your concerns with us. This is just going to keep building the database of information that we need to be able to really evaluate this. So with that, I asked one of our designers to be able to give us a presentation just on how engineers tackle a project like this. Because it's a lot to take in, there's a lot of different competing concerns, and I think just by understanding the process that a designer uses, it'll help you in kind of putting yourself in their shoes and maybe even kind of looking at this through the lens of a designer yourself. And hopefully what that does, that leads you also to thinking about potential solutions that we haven't considered yet. So I think just to kind of reintroduce the team, if you were here before, you probably heard very briefly from the team, but we'll do it again. I think it's just good to kind of just, so that you can put a face to the name and you know who to find after Christy gives her presentation. We'll invite you all, come on back up to the table again and share more ideas with us. But for now, we'll kick things off again and just kind of reintroduce the team. Christy, if you could kick us off again.
Again, I'm Christy Stout, and I work with traffic planning and design. And I'm a traffic consultant and engineering consultant, and I've worked with both public and private sector folks, both sides of this.
Nice.
Christy Carter with Friction Shift Projects. I am a active transportation and urban planner.
I'm Kelsey Morrow. I'm a recent graduate from UNC Charlotte's Urban Design, Master's in Urban Design program, and I have my bachelor's in urban planning, and I'm volunteering with the Design Center.
Rachel Bronson. I'm also with traffic planning design in our Asheville office, and I'm a transportation planner. We've done a lot of multimodal transportation work.
And I'm Colin Kenton with Traffic Planning Design, and I'm a traffic engineer that works with signals and access management projects.
So I knew that we would have a good turnout today. Not this big a turnout, and we have a limited team that can be able to deal with everyone, so I appreciate your patience as you kind of queue up to be able to speak to each one of us. And there are several folks here that are from Mountain True, the organization that the Design Center is nested within, and several of those folks will be up here at the tables as well. We're going to field your questions as best as possible and try to record them at every turn so that we're not missing anything. Again, though, if we do miss anything today, I will encourage you to go to our Facebook page. We'll publish that through the Sylva Herald and through the Smoky Mountain News so that information is available. We're going to just want to get as much input as possible. and then we'll bring it all back here 2 weeks from now, on Tuesday the 29th, 4 to 7 o'clock. We'll have NCDOT and Sylva government representatives here, and we will begin to sort through these ideas and see what works, what doesn't work, and what needs to be explored further. It's a you know, it can be a clumsy process sometimes, but we're looking at 2 miles plus of road that we're trying to make function as best as possible, and it's going to take a lot of examination and a lot of kind of test runs and exploring ideas. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Christy. She'll give a quick presentation on how engineers think, which was really an introduction for me. I'm not a designer myself. I understood how designers approach problem solving. It changed the way I approach designers. And so I think it can be really helpful for you as well. We'll also post this video online so that if you miss anything today or you want to share it with friends, it'll be available as well.
And we're completely volunteer in this capacity. But one of the things we find when we go into a community is that it's really hard when you start talking about, well, just shift the roadway 5 feet. I rode my bike with a couple advocates, and they didn't understand why DOT couldn't put a shoulder for the bike lane. There's plenty of room between the fence and the road. And when you start looking at things like, okay, well, you have to shift the grade, and there's a fence, and all the impacts, and then we need right-of-way, they started understanding some of the complexities. So what I did is just put together a brief presentation to talk about some of the things that a designer has to look at as they're planning a roadway. And I also am going to talk a little bit about DOT-specific constraints as well. So just lest you be confused, I am not on one side of this project or the other. I'm more just here to talk in general what it takes to design a roadway. And I wanted to start with this. Why the heck would someone design this? Okay, this was my company. So there is shame in this. And it made it across the country as a shame tactic for this design. I'll get back to it at the end, and then by the time we're through this, I want a few of you to tell me why we might have designed it this way, okay? So first of all, if you are DOT and you're doing a roadway widening project and you get funding from the federal government, you have to follow a set of codes, okay? So there are a national-wide U.S. code, Title 23, that Section 109, that tells you what you can and can't do on the roadway and how you have to progress, what you need to think about. You also have to follow Americans with Disability Act, so you have to consider people that might be in a wheelchair, visually impaired, hearing impaired. And you also have to follow the National Environmental Protection Act, okay? So there's these overarching acts that are law that have to be followed. And what you see here is the NEPA process, so that's the National Environmental Policy. And a lot of what you're seeing here is DOT coming through that process. So there's a certain level of environmental documentation that needs to be approved before they can move forward. What feeds that process are your transportation needs, safety, capacity, can roads travel through there? I'll go through those later. Your social impacts to businesses, your maybe historic sites, environmental impacts, economic impacts, and public input. So this is where we're at in the process. DOT, from my understanding, is working through this NEPA process. They're required, per that code, to fully consider adverse economic impacts, social and environmental effects. So you can see here there's a whole list of things that they have to adhere to. And that's the whole process. There's a lot of balancing here. Air pollution, noise pollution, water pollution, natural resources, displacement of people, and desirable community growth and regional growth. So these are just to give you an idea of some of the overarching principles. And then we have a slew of design manuals we have to follow. So if I'm a designer and I go in and say, I want to design an 8-foot through lane, and I design that and someone dies on my road, I could lose my license and I could be sued. So DOT and all the designers, we all have to follow these set of criteria. So just keep that in mind as we're asking people to do certain things. These are just a couple examples that are referenced in the code, the US code. And just to give you a little bit more about this process, so there's a first step, which I'm going to kind of point to as this. So the first step is you identify the transportation needs. So if you were walking down that corridor and you thought, is it good today? How many of you think that corridor is awesome as it is?
Question.
How many of you think that corridor is great as it is? Okay, if you had a concern about the corridor, what's bad about it? What could be improved? Feel free to, I really am curious.
Number of cars.
Safety, number of cars. What's that? Safety. For traffic flow.
Sensible design.
Sensible design.
Designers to drive the road a few times at peak hours.
I mean existing now. Is it good now? Yeah, is it good now? And what do you see as neat? Okay. So all those things you start saying, we would actually go in and study it. We collect the data, we crunch the numbers, and we have to document it. Okay, a DOT designer has to document that. And then what you do is when you start evaluating the impacts to a stream, or say there's a museum or a cultural resource, a park, you basically have to start showing that if you're going to do any of those impacts, there has to be a reason. It has to meet those transportation needs. And then you have to look at mitigating those as best you can. So it's this balancing act, just even before you get into design. You're thinking about what are the needs for the transportation system, what are the impacts, and does the final design meet those initial transportation needs? So if safety is an initial transportation need, but nothing's done to fix safety, they can't fund the project. So that's the whole process that has to be shown that, hey, if we're going to have impacts, we have to be solving a problem. So there's, you do the purpose and needs, then you look at your impacts, then you evaluate various alternatives. So you might have seen a few alternatives that DOT came forward with. And then there's interagency coordination. So then they have to go argue with Fish and Wildlife, or the Historic Commission, or all these local agencies that have jurisdiction over these things in the state to prove that whatever comes out of this is reasonable and that the impacts are not too great. And then if there are impacts, they have to mitigate them. And throughout this whole process is a public input. So that's kind of when DOT comes to you, they want you to weigh in on that. Okay, so here's a couple examples of things that can go into what is the purpose and the need for the project. So system linkage is one. So when you look at your roadways, one of the biggest challenges you have is that 107 is serving through traffic and local traffic because there's no network. So I think you guys have heard about this grid network, right? Do you have a roadway system for school kids to walk to school or someone to get to the grocery store? And is that the same roadway network you're using for truck traffic traveling through the state, right? So that's system linkage. Your capacity, can you get cars through? There's social needs, economic development. What is your long-term land use plan for the corridor? Relationships between transit, truck, bike, ped, all these intermodal relationships. Safety and your roadway deficiencies. So the roadway deficiencies and safety are tied closely together. And those all layer together to form like a framework for a systematic approach. So at the top you have your land use. What's the plan for the area? Do you have the transportation system to support that? What are your resources? How do you get over waterways? Do you need a bridge? And then cultural resources, and those all interact together, and that kind of goes into setting that framework. And just to kind of brief, I'm not going to go through all this, but here's a list of some of the most basic needs that are having to be balanced in the design. So your through traffic, your local traffic to Dunkin' Donuts, Walmart, things like that. Can the businesses be viable with whatever the design is? Safety, your physical constraints, we went through that. And I'm going to cover all these in greater detail, but environmental. And then one of the things people forget about is project delivery. So I know there's not a lot of empathy sometimes for a DOT staffer, but when they come in and they're saying, they have a limited cost and they have a delivery time frame. So if you come in late in the game, the project's all the way through the environmental process and you ask for a change that all of a sudden has an environmental impact and a huge cost, that will start the project all the way over sometimes, and it will make the project delayed. Maybe it could delay a project by 5 years sometimes. So knowing when to provide that input early, make sure you're getting educated now, because early in the process is where you'll have more success. And then obviously maintenance, construction considerations, and then finally the cost. So one of the things we were looking at is your growth. This is the future growth plan for this area. And in order to support that, you need a transportation network. And right now, this corridor has 32,000 vehicles per day already, so I'm sure you're all aware of this. But these are things that would be documented in your needs for the corridor. You might look at connectivity and terrain. I pulled this one up because it shows, the thing we all know is that there's a couple mountains that are prohibiting us expanding the transportation network. Are there alternative routes? How can you connect your community? Bicycle and pedestrian modes, that's something we have to think about. Especially on a road like this. I mean, if bike is the only mode you have or your mode of choice, it really isn't a safe corridor to be riding on. So can we make it safer? Right now, pedestrians, if you want to cross at a signal, you have to walk quite a distance along this corridor. So what happens if you have to walk half a mile to get to a signal is most people are going to get impatient and they're going to run across the road. So these are things we have to think about in our planning. And right now, the mix of uses along that corridor generates a lot of traffic, pedestrian traffic, because you have uses like a Taco Bell and restaurants and diners and personal services. So these are the types of uses that are more likely to generate pedestrian demand. And so it's important that the plans safely accommodate them. And then we also have to think about those with disabilities. So how are they getting around town? So they might take the local transit service and get dropped off at Walmart, but can you get to the door, or can you get next door to run your errands? So one of the things we have to do is think about whether the facility is adequate for someone with a disability or someone taking transit. So I pulled up a couple examples here just to show you your corridor and some of the things that might be a challenge with if you come in and recommend something, what we'll have to look at. This graphic right here is a little misplaced here, but I don't know if you all can see this. There's a left turning vehicle here shown in blue. Okay, and there's a shadow casting across here to see, and basically it's their line of sight. So if there's another left turning vehicle here, they cannot see past them to see an oncoming traffic, right? So when you're designing an intersection, we have to think about even little things like, it seems little maybe when you're just looking at a plan, but when it's functioning, that could result in a crash and a fatality, right? So designers are looking at all these constraints to make sure that even just the little turning movements are safe from a sight distance perspective. Another thing, what other constraints do people see in this picture that might affect our ability to widen the road? Anyone? Power poles. Yep, the light poles. It's a big one. Any others? Yeah, the buildings. What happens to this lot if you widen to here? Is that space usable anymore? Yeah, you might actually have to take the entire property sometimes if you take away someone's usable space to the point where they can't use the property. Power poles, sometimes we don't realize that just to move it, sometimes the entire line needs to be redesigned, and power poles well beyond the corridor need to be moved. So the costs and the challenges with that design. So asking for a power pole to be moved late in the process is often not possible. Those are a couple examples there. Signals and intersections are the most challenging part, right? So we have to deal with how long you're waiting at the intersection, safety, need for turn lanes, and it's often really constrained. So I know we talked to the owner of a restaurant here, is it Bogart's? He was here earlier, and he's right at that intersection, so a lot of the widening is going to impact his circulation. So obviously the intersections would really constrain a lot of the corridor. So we had to pay, DOT or any designer is going to have to pay a lot of attention to these locations. How about this? What do you think about this person who's selling their property? What might this implications of widening there? Say we had to widen out to here. Does anybody think what that might do to their property? Any ideas?
It make it unusable.
Yeah, it could affect how much value they can get from it, whether it's usable access. So we have to think about future land use, not just what's there now. And then the terrain, obviously with the mountains, some of it's just not buildable. And I think you guys are probably all really familiar with this, right? So in order to build a 4-foot, 5-foot buffer and a 5-foot sidewalk here, you're pretty much eliminating all those parking spaces. So it's the viability of some business, right? So unfortunately, there's trade-offs, and it's really challenging sometimes to figure out in this corridor where it's tied on both sides. Those are some of the challenges designers have to work through. And then they have to go during the right-of-way process, designers have to go negotiate terms with each of these property owners for right-of-way acquisition and for how that design will look. And how about truck turns, right? We have a national network of cargo routes. People need to get their deliveries right to your business for business viability. So one thing we have to do is turning radii for vehicles and trucks. So here's an example of if you had to do a U-turn there, it's not going to work. So that was just a little comic relief. But in general, that's something that needs to be looked at detailed. If we're going to have a location where trucks need to circulate, it's going to affect the design footprint, right? So for them to be able to make a U-turn. And then structures, right? So a structure, a bridge is really an obstacle often. Has anybody ever been through a design situation where a bridge is being built in place while the other one's torn out? Right, so temporary bridges, that requires a really wide footprint and the road has to shift. And in an area that's really tight, that's a challenge. So one of the things, when you have a bridge, you're thinking about how do you build it, right? So how can you maintain traffic while you're building the roadway? And bridges are really expensive, and the environmental permitting with those are challenging too. So when you have a creek underneath and potential impacts. So these are just items that are a little more challenging, at a whole nother level of design for an engineer. So this example shows drainage. So I don't know if y'all can see the little inlets here. Okay, so if those structures right there where the water's draining into them has nowhere to go now, or the pipes are broken, or we're adding water to those, then we have to design for that increased intake. That's an entire level of design plan underneath just the surface of what we see that has certain standards and criteria that need to be met. So just even thinking, when you're talking widening, the drainage for that and the additional stormwater management is quite an undertaking for an engineer. I love this one because of all the constraints in here. So clearly the utilities, to try to move those poles is going to be a heavy lift, right? One of the other things people don't always think about is when you look at things like, say, a guardrail. They have very specific requirements, how we end those. There's been lawsuits because people get impacted and then it hurts people in a vehicle. So the end treatments have to be designed appropriately. They have to be offset a certain distance from the road. So even just little things like that we sometimes don't think about become challenging. And then when you get into the urban areas, one of the things are balancing the needs. So this is a brewery, right? Innovation? Yeah. So walking to and from that, you can see that this is a really tight corridor. So you have traffic, bikes, pedestrians, crossings all in one little area, including parking. And so these areas get really challenging to meet all the needs. So I just picked this up as an example of an area that has a lot of competing functions on the roadway that are challenging. Here's another one. You have driveways competing with the railroad. And I think a couple of people were saying there's some really challenging movements here because people turn off the road and then head up the side street and it's really uncontrolled. So those are things that are not always easy solutions, and we have to work within our given parameters and tools that we have as engineers. And then just really, most importantly, the crash history here. So I just pulled this up. We always look at safety and crash analysis, but I thought because we're talking about this corridor, I would pull some data. And you can see here the green is 0 to 33, their safety scores, lower being safer. This corridor is all red. It's on the higher scale. And I was not involved in the studies, so I would have to defer to DOT and their consultant. But it's really obvious by looking at this corridor. And I think some of you have brought that up. The safety issues are big. And likely that is one of the primary purpose and needs for this project. Here's another example of sight distances, right? So if you come up here and you're stopped and you're looking to exit, trying to see around this building is going to be a challenge, right? So these are things for every intersection and traffic movement, we need to make sure there's free flow and that you can see to exit safely. This is my favorite one. In this short 2,000-foot section, there are between 35 and 40 curb cuts, and many of them are really, really wide. So this is probably your biggest safety issue. So when you have a two-way left turn lane, like what you have down there, many people call it a suicide lane. I'm sure you know why. So if someone's trying to turn left and you come over at the same time, you're head-on traffic, right? And then they also have all these exiting and entering movements, and they're not in an organized fashion. So what we do as transportation engineers is a thing called access management. And so you'll see on the plans where they're trying to tighten up the number of driveways there are, make them cleaner and more clear as far as traffic control, and that should be a huge safety improvement. And another thing that's done for access management is a median, right? So to eliminate the number of left turns in and out that can occur. And then we also look at multimodal safety. This is an example, I pulled this down from DOT's website, of a history of crashes. The green dots are pedestrian and pink are bikes. So when we see a history of crashes, we look closely at those to make sure that whatever we're designing makes it safer and not worse. And then we look at crossings. I love this example from Google Street View. So it looks like there's parking possibly for, is it the paper mill that's across the street here? Is that where that is?
That's their pumping station.
Yeah. So there's a crosswalk with very little warning signs, a little hard to see. So if you're right here making a left or coming from this approach, it's going to be very hard to see a pedestrian behind that truck. So these are things, we look at crossings, that's one of the biggest safety issues for pedestrians. So as an engineer, these take a lot of extra care to design. Other things we don't think about, lighting at night, if you have pedestrians at night, for cars as well. Electrical service, when you have electrical devices like signals, or this is an example of a flashing beacon, those things, we have to find ways to get them electric service. Below ground utilities, the impacts on those, who's going to maintain and own things. There are certain guidelines that DOT follows. We might be able to post a roadway for 20, how many times have we been like, oh, I wish the speed limit was lower on a road, but people are traveling 50 and it's posted at 35. So we can't just arbitrarily come in and say, okay, let's post it at 35. We have to do something to change the design to encourage lower speeds, so that it's not just on the police department to enforce that, because that won't sustain a decent speed. And then constructability and staging, so we talked about the bridges, that's an example, but during traffic, during construction, you're doing some widening, you have to shift all the traffic, and sometimes that construction staging dictates the design a bit, because it has to be something that can keep traffic flowing during construction. And then maintenance. So I just really wanted to land with that. This is just a really broad overarching topic, right? And every corridor is different. That's why I tried to pull some examples from your corridor. But there are a lot of competing needs out here. And 32,000 vehicles per day. It's regional connectivity. This is regional and local traffic on that road, and there aren't a lot of other options. You have to accommodate your future growth as well. And multimodal. You need access to your local business. You don't want to kill someone's business. And the one phrase I really like, and I think sometimes we have to keep in mind, is sometimes it's, it's about saving lives, and sometimes it's safety first and safety only. So, we really need to build our network in the future in a way that saves lives. So I think we just need to keep that in mind as we're compromising on the corridor. And then keep in mind the DOT has to go through their purpose and need and come back in the end with a plan that meets that need. So it will be helpful when you're asking them, ask what they're trying to solve along the corridor, and keep that in mind with recommendations or any feedback you give. And then, have we minimized the impact and mitigated it if possible? Can it be built? Can it be funded? It's never going to be perfect, but can we get enough people, with consensus to do something that helps the community? And I've seen projects that get killed because the community doesn't want it, and the project need was set by somebody who didn't really understand the community's needs, so it's worth having the conversation, but I think that you have to look at the facts of what's going on in the corridor and really come together to find something that works for your community. So that's the main question, can you get to consensus? And let's go back. I thought I put that picture at the end. So I'm going to go back to it. Why do you think the crazy designers designed that ADA crossing? Okay, who said that? It's very possible there was a bus stop there. I was wondering that myself. It's a ramp. Yeah, ramp to nowhere. Yeah, so sometimes once you put someone in a street, they need to be able to get out. Yeah.
Is that because of flood control?
That's a good guess. The grades there. Any other thoughts? It's a horrible answer because they made us. So there's a design requirement that we have to provide ADA. Now, and some people, I don't know, how many of you have been really crazed by when you go see a ramp built to nowhere, right? It just ends, and DOT's building these ramps in like a 5-foot section, they're a developer. Okay, but in the future, if this land is redeveloped, now they can tie into a ramp, and they don't have to revise this entire signal, which could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And a design process that takes years. It's ready for the connection. Now, that's typically why the DOT required that. In this instance, with the grades there and the newness of that development, it'll likely never happen. But the answer is because the design criteria made us. It's not a brilliant answer, but it doesn't always make sense. So hopefully that's helpful. I don't know if there's any questions or any lead into that, but it's just something that we need to keep in mind as we're making comments for folks.
Are you following the NEPA process because there's federal money involved?
Yeah, state and federal funds have to follow the NEPA process.
So there is federal funding involved?
Yeah. And I believe, so there's different levels of documentation. There's certain levels of categorical exclusion. So if there's very little impact, they go through a different process. And then there's an environmental assessment that's a little more detailed. And then you've probably heard of an environmental impact statement, an EIS. So that's like I-26 in Asheville, and that's a lot more of a robust report and analysis. So I think this is at a CE from my understanding.
So it's not so much that there's necessarily federal funding, it's just that the federal government requires it.
Yeah, so, and you know, it's the pendulum, right? Like I talked to people that worked in DOT that I work with now that are my company, and they used to throw, I mean, they saw people throwing equipment and burying it when they were building roadway projects. I mean, it's horrible practices, right? Years ago, and now it's like, okay, we've become more environmentally conscious, but sometimes, you know, there are these hoops we have to jump through to be environmentally conscious, and there's a balancing act, right? So sometimes it's quite onerous.
You can count the number of pedestrians and or bicycles. In other words, do you need a bicycle lane on both sides?
Right.
What determines if I have to ride down in a car to make a U-turn and come back, why would I not think the same way with a bicycle?
And I actually can lean on some of my partners here in volunteering on that, but I'll just give you the brief answer that, you know, they're really the most vulnerable users on a roadway, right? So if you need to go by bike, if you get hit, at anyone traveling over 25 miles an hour, your chances of surviving are thin. So
I think safety is extremely important.
Yeah.
I'm just asking if you need one on both sides of the road, or you can have one on one side of the road and they travel to other business and come back the other way.
Yeah, so bikes have to travel due to the vehicle code law. They have to travel as a vehicle, so they have to travel in the right direction unless you separate them on a side path or something.
Is there any way to put the bike lane right down the middle of the big median?
I have seen it done before, a center cycle track. They're hard to get in and out of, but
Before.
yeah.
They can cross with a pedestrian crossing.
But the thing in this corridor, just to keep in mind, then you wouldn't be able to turn left across it because that would be unsafe for all the users. So.
I mean, when you talk about the expense of thousands of people's livelihoods, you know, for a recreational activity, should that not be toward the back end of,
Right.
you know?
And then the question, is it recreational or is it out of need? Many of the people that are walking and biking, it is not a transportation choice. It's a requirement to get around town.
If they're riding on the right side of the road, say they're supposed to ride on the right side because they're traveling one direction, they need to get to the left, how are they going to do that anyways?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And then if they're riding right down the center, there's less, because you guys are going to restrict the flow of turns, right? You're going to get rid of the suicide lane, or they're planning on getting rid of the suicide lane. There'll be less turns that they'll have to go straight through, versus if they're riding on the right side of the road and people are turning in and out of driveways. I would think that would be more dangerous than putting the bike lane right down the middle of the median.
So when you put it down the median, you need to have a buffer. So you'll need, you know, 4 or 5 feet for each direction of travel. So, and then you need a buffer from traffic, and then nobody can turn across. So it would really severely limit all your businesses because you wouldn't be able to get into their business. And the U-turns, I mean, you would need a lot bigger footprint probably to do that than to do what. Bike lanes are the least impact of all your bike facilities.
I mean, it's accounting for 10 feet of road.
Yeah.
Widening. I mean, that's a lot. If you could do 10 feet less down this whole stretch of road and somehow put it in the median, I mean, the median's supposed to be 17 feet wide anyways. So if you put it, you know, not necessarily a 10 foot bike median.
We'll take a hard look at that, definitely.
Yeah.
And that's an idea that we've heard several times.
Yeah, and just keep in mind the 17-foot median is for a 12-foot turn lane, 10 to 12-foot turn lane when you get to an intersection. And then it's your minimum size barrier, so it might be 2 to 4 foot curb, mountable curb. And then you have to stripe your lane markings beyond that. So it's kind of your minimum footprint for median, but it's for the left turns. So in looking at that, just know that's a big constraint to what you're recommending, but it can be looked at.
How wide is the bike lane supposed to be the minimum on that? Just
5 is minimum, but
going one way.
on a road this high, I would buffer it if I had the right of way. I would put like more than 5.
So you need 5 feet.
5's minimum, yep.
Is it at 5 feet, it has to be one lane?
One direction. Yeah, you can't do 2 direction on one side of the road unless you separate it somehow.
In the eastern part of the state, it is separate. The eastern part of the state, the bike lanes have their own lane.
Yeah.
Not even on the road. So
Right.
it's funny that the eastern part of the state, which is really poor, has done that and taken that time to do that. And we are the state has not done it. But they
And that's a
have
good,
definite
it's a
own
good point, right? Because we talk a lot about you maximize your own, like you create like a shared use path or something like that, it's safer for families. I mean, you know, things like that, but it takes right away as well. So
The beach has its own, they took it.
yeah, it's apps. Awesome.
So it's not even part of the road.
Agreed.
Is there such a clause that busy that no bicycles are allowed in that area. There's no bicycles on 40 going, through Asheville. I mean, is there a clause where that is, it's just too busy, there's no way a bicycle is allowed in a certain area?
So on state freeways, most states prohibit them, but roads are considered vehicles, and in almost every state in the country, they're allowed to go wherever a car could go. And it would be different if there were alternative routes. I think you could sign and direct people and encourage them to go another way, but then we'd have to develop another way. So, yeah.
And then, sorry, so if a bicycle doesn't have a bike lane, it can take that lane, and
Yes.
by law, the bike can take the lane, so the cars have to back up behind the bicycle.
Yeah, then they're stuck waiting behind them.
That's that way now.
Yeah, right.
There's signs on the road saying share the lane with the bikes.
Yeah, and there's only so many people that are brave enough to do that. I am not one, not on that road.
Can I ask you a question about the lane width? Because I moved down here from the DC area 2 years ago, and there's been a lot of effort up there to improve the flow of traffic in urban areas and things like that. And one of the things that's been real big is reducing lane width, going from 12 to 10 because people are less likely to speed.
Right.
Is that a possibility here?
That is very valid, and often that comes down to division at DOT as far as what they're able to in their policy flex on. So I can't answer that here, but it is definitely something that people look at. I mean, in southern states with their 5-lane cross sections, we have a couple where we live at like 17-foot wide lanes, which is like, God knows we don't need that, right? So, yeah.
Would it be possible to put the electrical, I know the easements for the electrical lines are a big issue on this. It could increase the footprint of the road dramatically.
So we are, we're reaching out to the utilities to, they typically in this process come in rather late in the game, and they can upset things by coming in late. Trying to bring the utilities to the table much earlier than typical to get them to be able to answer questions just like that, so that we don't come up with a great plan and then utilities come in and say, oh no, this isn't going to happen.
I see a lot of cities, I mean, they have the street lights and everything in the median, and my question would be, why couldn't you put the underground utilities in the median, and that would keep you from having to take that additional easement?
I mean, that's a comment we could bring back. Sometimes it comes down to maintenance, right? So if you're in the median having to stop traffic and you need a safe working area, and you have to do work on those utilities, it becomes more impactful to traffic. But yeah, I'm not saying I know the answer to that. That would have to go to probably DOT for a question and comment. Yeah. Did you all want to comment at all on the bike ped and connectivity? Okay.
Just the only thing I would add is, Christy mentioned this when we were talking about a bike lane. Do we want to design for people that are fearless and they're willing to get out and share the lane, like there's a conversation, or do we want to build something that is more comfortable for people of all ages and all abilities? Maybe families want to get out and ride. So that's where some of the decision making comes down to, if you build a better, more comfortable facility, you are looking at taking more space. But that has to be a community decision. Who do you want to serve? Do you want to serve no one and have it shared, or do you want to go on the other end?
And to expand on that, we've done these presentations that talk about the benefits of walking and biking in a community. And we didn't touch on that today, but there are benefits, economic benefits, health benefits, community benefits. So I'm not trying to say that's what your community needs, but keeping in mind it's a little bigger than just that one person on a bike. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody would leisurely put their family on the side of the road.
What's interesting, until you change the dynamic and your traffic calming, you'd be surprised. it was Southern California, but on a similar 5-lane cross section, and we're driving down the road, and there's a guy in a wheelchair in the bike lane because the sidewalk wasn't being maintained. So looked like a veteran, with his little flag on the back, and a family with 2 kids without helmets on riding in the bike lane. You'd be surprised once there's that space and the cultural norms change, people do. So, it's something to keep in mind. Yep.
Hey.
Hey.
Okay, so funding for this, there's probably a significant percentage coming from federal highway, a lot of federal highway money now, and is it a requirement that the bike lanes slash sidewalks are not a problem, but the bike lanes are going to cause you to take a significant more amount of right-of-way from people, and you're already barely got enough to do what you want to do, and you're already taking some businesses. My question is this: I drive from about 7 o'clock to 4:30, 3 days a week, and I see one guy riding a bike to work. I assume he's going to work because I see him every day about the same time. He comes from Dillsboro. He came the other day, it's freezing cold. He was riding his bike. I figure he's going to work. But he came from Dillsboro, and I don't know where he stops, maybe center of town. I also drive out toward Cullowhee. There's a bike lane from Ingalls all the way to the university. I bet you ain't seen 3 bikes on there in 2 years. So my question is, the federal funding component of this project, is that going to require bike lanes to be included, or is that something that the consensus of the people? I mean, you don't see that many bikes. Yeah, you see one from time to time. But by and large, you don't see like you would in a metropolitan area. So my question is it a requirement based on the funding component from the federal government?
So first of all, as far as is it a requirement, in general in every project, no. Is it part of the needs on this project? I'm not sure. So if one of the needs is to improve bike safety.
It's not a requirement.
Not for every road in the country, right? So you'd have to look at the specific corridor. The other thing to keep in mind too, similar to bike sidewalks, and I'll be transparent here. I believe that, you know, roads that are safer for bikes and peds are safer for all, because it tends to do traffic calming and help your community. So that's a personal bias I have.
Well, and if you had unlimited right-of-way, that's fine.
Right, and there's trade-offs for sure. Yep, absolutely.
I got a question about the number of businesses, because when this was all first came about, after the meeting over at SCC, when they showed the original drawings, they said 55 businesses. That map is showing businesses that weren't at risk on the original map. I'm just wondering how many businesses we're up to.
Yeah, I don't know.
So the businesses that you see on this map were simply placed just so that people could be able to identify where you are on the road. They're not necessarily on the map because they're at risk.
Oh, I know, but there are businesses that are at risk on that map now that were not at risk on the original map. You got lines going right through buildings that didn't have lines going through.
So sometimes those lines are temporary construction. Well, they wouldn't go through a building.
I realize that.
Yeah, I didn't look at that. That's a DOT question. We don't know.
The design has changed. I'm just wondering how many businesses.
Yeah, I don't know.
And we'll do that analysis and take a look and consult with DOT, because
that's why we're here.
I know that the number was about 55 was the last that I saw in the Sylva Herald.
Right.
And I know that number can change. I mean, it could be more if the design were to take more properties. It could be less if we can find better solutions that can.
But that's a good question.
And that's one of the goals here tonight, is to try and find ways that we can reduce that number as much as possible. We know that that's the lifeblood of Sylva, and I'm sure the folks that are representing Sylva and DOT all know that. And it's a matter of dealing with all those constraints that Christy went through today, to try and find a way to be able to save as many of those businesses as possible. So
and colored plans can help. Maybe we can come up with a way to code, because you can actually show where there's permanent takes and where it's taking a building versus just some parking area. So there may be some way for us to code those to be a little more clear.
Yeah, because I'm honestly, the business that I have, the original drawings showed there was still going to be at least enough room for a car to get across the front of the building. Now it's showing the sidewalk right up against our porch.
Got it. It's a big difference.
Caesars has a turnaround going through it that wasn't there before. It was in an empty field, now it's going right through Little Caesars. So it's changed, and I'm just wondering.
So is that something that you did note on the map, by the way?
Yes.
All right, yeah, really important. And that goes for everyone here. If you've got that kind of observation, we absolutely need to have that on this map, because that's how we're going to collect all this information. We're only going to be able to process so much tonight. Remembering that a lot of these folks are coming from their day jobs today, and now they're putting in extra hours. We'll sit down with this stuff and we'll really pour over it afterwards, and we're going to try and come up with as many answers as possible.
I think what happened, there was a turnaround in an empty field, and they took that one out and put two separate.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
It just doesn't make sense.
And maybe we need to figure out where the overlap is as far as DOT's design change, and we'll have to communicate if we're going to be helping.
Yes. And maintenance people be here at the next meeting?
We won't, I doubt that we'll get utilities at the next meeting, but we will have town maintenance, we will have DOT at the next meeting, and it's, you know, we certainly want to be able to field questions, but we also want to actually get working through some of these problems. And because it will involve some public officials, we felt it was safer just make the meeting public, just in case there was a quorum of public officials there, and you have enough notice and things like that. It makes it a messy process to do that kind of problem solving in an auditorium, but that's I think the best way to try and solve these things is to be as transparent as possible.
To answer the questions that need to be
Yeah,
answered.
and you know, there's going to be times, and I'll be completely straightforward with you, there will be times when the answer is not going to be great. And you know, in hopes, that's part of what Christy was trying to lay out today, is there's just times when you are forced into a decision that doesn't work. Doesn't work for, you know, for some folks, and it's unfortunate, and it's just something that we have to try and work around. But we're going to try and minimize that as much as possible.
So one point before you go too, I was talking to Rose before this, and I'm sure you all are aware that there had been a bypass plan at one point, and you know the impact on those properties. They fought the project, and then they came back to this, and you know there can be this yo-yo effect, and then you're 20 years down the road, and you're supposed to be planning for a 50-year road, but nothing's been built, and then you're stuck with an I-26 that's backed up all the time, you know. So thinking ahead, but go ahead, yeah, sorry. Yeah, yeah.
So the question was, why is the bypass not being considered at this stage? And my understanding, and I don't have enough history in this community, I'm sure there'll be others that can address this better than I can, but my understanding was that this was something that the community dealt with 8 to 10 years ago. And in fact, I believe that that's what formed Smart Roads, was in response to the bypass of, and I may get your motto incorrect, but it's, what is it? No, not more roads, smarter roads? Don't someone give you your tagline? Smart roads, not new roads. I think the idea at that time was that there was going to be such an impact by creating a new road that the community really fought that and pushed for, let's look at 107 and make it a better road. So 8 years later, here we are trying to make 107 a better road. And so I understand, you know, there's going to be a lot of folks that are saying, you know what, it's not getting any better. Maybe we should look at the bypass again. I think that we would be here 10 years later, you know, 10 years from now, we'll be, you know, then saying, well, why are we looking at 107?
I wanted to just thank you for taking the time to put together this presentation. I thought it was really helpful to show how complicated the decision-making process is in that. So I don't have a question.
Yeah, I do not envy the designers for this roadway. It is not an easy feat. Were you going to say so?
I was just going to, I mean, one thing, because I come at it from the planning side, I am not a designer. I never want to be a roadway designer because of all of those things. But I think in the planning context, one thing that's hard is that we know what we know right here and right now, what's in front of us and what we're used to and what we're accustomed to. But this is a huge investment that the community is making, and it needs to serve those of us who use this road now and today. It's going to be here for 50 years or 100 years, and we have to try as best as we can with the information that we can to think about what is happening in the transportation world, how are people getting around, what's changing, and then how does the roadway fit that. And so when we think about bike lanes, there's no, I am a brave bicyclist. I will go most places. You are not going to find me on 107 today. But if something changed a little bit, I probably would be willing to ride my bike on that. And so, and that is a transportation pattern that is increasing across the country, including in rural areas. So I'm not saying that to advocate a point to you that you must have bike lanes, but think about what future uses may be needed along this road. It's getting more expensive to live in Jackson County. Car ownership across the country is getting more expensive, so are people going to need to use bicycles not as a recreation, spandex activity, but as an essential form of transportation? So again, sounds very advocacy. I'm not advocating that. What I'm advocating for is to think long-term about what this road is going to be used for, because it's going to be here long after everybody in this room is.
I apologize if you all spoke about this earlier, but
I hear a lot of concern about adding bike lanes in there. Has there been any consideration to look at, well, what's going to be the negative economic impact of making the additional space for those bike lanes versus locating those bike lanes, somebody said, off the road somewhere? I understand you're still going to have to deal with roadways, but you have some other options there in terms of, like the Greenway and totally runs along the sewer easement. And I know, 20 years ago when I was in Chapel Hill, you could ride from one end of town to the other. It was always on bike paths. You never had to be on the main road. And because of that, it makes it so much safer than everybody wants to ride their bikes. I'm with the lady down in front. I've ridden my bike from Cullowhee to Dillsborough before, and every time I felt like I'd take my life in my hands. But if there was an alternate route that was safer, I could do it every day.
Yeah, agreed.
Is that a possible trade-off to look at?
So that comes down to all these engineering feasibility. I would say the question is a big question, and someone would have to look at alternative alignments, and I think the terrain is one that would have to be looked at pretty carefully.
One thing I would point out, though, is that there was conversation going on earlier about having a parallel road behind the businesses. It would be a lot easier to put a bike path behind the businesses than it would a full-size road.
And then we have to think about how to get them from that parallel road to the business on the street, but that might be an easier task, yeah. Sorry.
I would like to be able, we'll take a few more questions and then we'll just ask people to come on back up and present those questions back on paper, because I know some of us are capturing some of this, but I want to make sure that we're getting these comments on paper, because our brains can only contain so much today. But yes, sir.
Last question on the U-turn concept, median down the middle and go down and make a U-turn. Are those designed to be correlated to traffic lights, where that oncoming traffic stops for a period of time to make those U-turns, or are you still making the left turn but in a more controlled fashion in front of oncoming traffic?
So I can only answer to the degree that I asked DOT and heard that they will not be signalized, from my understanding, but it will function like a left turn and it will be more organized. But I don't know if I should, yeah. But that's what was relayed to me, but maybe that's a good question when we do get DOT back in the room.
Because I'm just thinking, if you've got a lot of U-turn traffic, you still have the oncoming traffic.
Yes.
Starting all the way across to get into that other thing.
And there are traffic engineering studies to address that. And
it's safer than the suicide line.
Yeah.
I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying, is it thought out by relation to lights?
And we'll have to ask to see if they studied it. I just don't know if they did. Yeah.
The technology's there to signalize it.
Right.
This woman's had her hand up for a long time.
Yes, with all the money that's you've got 2 lanes of traffic going south, you've got 2 lanes going north. When you get done with all of this, you still got 2 lanes of traffic going north. What have you done to alleviate the traffic?
That's teed up for you, I know.
So that comes down to purpose and need. Why are they doing the project in the first place? Likely it's safety, right? So, and there are other things other than adding lanes, building more roads. Sometimes it's smarter roads, right? You can do smarter traffic signals, you can do progression, you can get better timings, you can do adaptive systems. I'm not saying that's what the need was, but it probably is a question about the purpose and need, and it likely was safety from what I'm seeing.
And I may get this wrong if there's someone in the room that can correct me. My understanding was that this road was originally a 4-lane road. It was then restriped to be a 5-lane road. We've got suicide lanes. And in doing so, those lanes got constrained. And I felt it today. As we came in, the reason that we showed up right at 4 o'clock was we decided, hey, great idea, let's go down to Webster Road and come back. And in coming back and experiencing the traffic on that section of the road, we realized just how claustrophobic it felt. Because we're in maybe it's an 11-foot lane, but it was a pretty tight lane. And that in itself affects speed, affects flow of traffic. And so there are smarter designs that can allow a 4-lane road to travel, one 4-lane road to travel more optimally than another 4-lane road, simply by better design. And I say that not being a designer myself, but having a lot of faith in the folks that spend all day thinking about this.
Right.
Maybe you had a question, and then I'm going to ask, and then we'll wrap it up and we'll pull folks up.
I think that everyone should consider that Western is growing so quickly that if we expand the bike lane for Western all the way to the top of Sylva, more people without cars, a lot of students don't have cars, they can ride their bikes all the way to the businesses. So you'd actually be growing economically because you'd have more students coming. And they wouldn't have to wait for their friend to bring them or take the cab to Walmart and then walk somewhere. I mean, like, that's just an idea.
Yeah. there's many of us sharing that space, and I think that's a good point, right?
All right, thank you very much. I know that there's still some hands up, so I'm just going to ask you folks that have those questions, bring them up to the table for us so that we can hear them. We're going to make sure that we capture all this information, we'll publish it, and we'll put it back out there for everyone. Thanks for now.
Thanks.
Great job. That was a great presentation.